They called him a relic. They called him a stubborn old fool who was afraid of the future. When the rest of Cedar Ridge County was signing million-dollar loans for computerized tractors that drove themselves, Silas Abernathy was out in his barn, covered in grease, welding the frame of a 1949 Farmall M that had seen more sunsets than the local banker. The neighbors laughed. They pointed at his rusted fenders and shook their heads, pitying the man who refused to get with the times. But they forgot one simple rule of survival: debt is a master, and iron is a servant. 10 years later, the laughter stopped, because when the dust settled, Silas didn't just still have his tractor. He had their deeds. The mid-morning sun over Cedar Ridge, Nebraska, usually brought the smell of damp earth and diesel, but today, inside Martha's kettle. The local diner, the air smelled of burnt coffee and arrogance. Silas Abernathy sat in his usual booth, the vinyl cracked and taped with silver duct tape that matched the knees of his overalls. He was a man carved from granite and weathered by 60 harsh winters. His hands, wrapped around a heavy ceramic mug, were permanently stained with the dark ink of oil and soil. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. Across the room, holding court at the center table, was Carter Sterling. Carter was the new face of farming in the county. At 40 years old, he didn't wear overalls. He wore pressed Wranglers and a polo shirt with a Seed Company logo embroidered on the chest. He was loud, expansive, and currently drowning in the euphoria of his latest acquisition. "It's not just a tractor, boys," Carter boomed, gesturing with a piece of toast. "It's a mobile command center. The cabin has climate control surround sound and a fridge. I don't even have to touch the wheel. GPS draws the lines to within an inch. While you guys are sweating it out, I'm checking stocks on the iPad." A few of the younger farmers' guys, like Toby Miller and Greg Henderson, nodded in awe. They were good boys, but they were terrified of being left behind. They looked at Carter's shiny dually truck parked outside, then at his massive 600-horsepower green beast of a tractor waiting on a flatbed, and they felt inadequate. Then Carter turned his eyes toward the corner booth. "Hey, Silas," Carter called out, his voice dripping with that faux-friendly tone that masks a sneer. "You still running that heap of scrap metal? What is it, a 49? Silas didn't look up from his black coffee. "It's a 49 Farmall M, and she runs fine." "Runs fine." Carter laughed, looking around the room for support. "Silas, that thing has less horsepower than my lawnmower. I heard you were out in the south pasture for 3 days just turning soil. My rig could have done that in 4 hours. You're losing money every second you sit on that iron seat." Silas finally looked up. His eyes were a pale, piercing blue, contrasting with the dark grit on his face. "I own the Farmall, Carter. The bank owns your rig." The diner went quiet. It was the kind of silence where you could hear the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Carter's smile tightened. It was a sore spot. Everyone knew Carter had leveraged his inheritance, 300 acres of prime bottomland, to finance a fleet of machinery that cost more than most houses. "It's called leverage, Silas." Carter snapped his face, flushing slightly. "It's how business works in the 21st century. You gotta spend money to make money. Efficiency is the name of the game. If you aren't expanding, you're dying. You're farming like it's 1950, and frankly, it's embarrassing for the rest of us. Makes the whole county look backward." "Efficiency." Silas repeated the word slowly, tasting it. "Is that what they call it when you can't fix your own belt drive without a laptop and a technician from 3 counties over?" "I have a service contract." Carter slammed his hand on the table. "I don't need to turn wrenches. I'm a manager, a CEO of the soil." Silas stood up. He wasn't a tall man, but he had a density to him, a heaviness that commanded space. He dropped 3 crumpled dollar bills on the table for his coffee. "A CEO," Silas grunted as he walked past Carter's table. "Just remember, Carter, when the note comes due, the bank doesn't care about your surround sound. They just want the dirt." He walked out into the blinding sunlight. The door chimed behind him, sealing the diner back into its bubble of modern delusions. Silas climbed into his 1995 Ford pickup, another vehicle he kept running with baling wire and prayers, and drove back to his sanctuary. His farm, the Refuge, wasn't the biggest in the county. It was 180 acres of rolling hills and stubborn clay. But it was his. Every fence post, every barn board, every inch of soil was paid for. He pulled into the gravel drive and parked. There, sitting under the lean-to of the main barn, was the Iron Lady. The Farmall M. She wasn't pretty to the untrained eye. The red paint had long ago oxidized into a deep maroon rust. The tires were mismatched, and the seat was a simple steel pan with a faded cushion tied to it. But the engine block was clean, free of grime. The wiring was new. The hydraulic lines were fresh. Silas walked over and rested his hand on the warm metal of the hood. He could feel the history in the iron. His father Arthur had bought this tractor, new. It had ploughed the fields during the wet years of the 70s and the drought of the 80s. It had survived the farm crisis, when half the neighbors were auctioned off on the courthouse steps. "They don't understand you, old girl," Silas whispered. He climbed up, settled into the seat, and pressed the starter. The engine didn't whine, it roared, a rhythmic, guttural chug, chug, chug that vibrated through Silas's spine. It was the heartbeat of the farm. Silas engaged the PTO power takeoff and lifted the bush hog. He had work to do. He didn't have GPS. He didn't have AC. He had the wind in his face, the smell of diesel, and the satisfaction of knowing that if this tractor broke in half, he could weld it back together before supper. But as he drove toward the back 40, he saw the dust cloud rising from the east. It was Carter Sterling's new monster, tearing through the neighboring field, covering 20 acres, for every one of Silas's. For a brief moment, a seed of doubt planted itself in Silas's chest. Was he a fool? Was he holding on to the past, simply out of pride? The world was moving so fast, and he was moving at the speed of 1949. He shook the thought away as he shifted gears. Speed costs money, he told himself. And money is the one thing none of us truly have. 2 years passed. The seasons turned with their usual indifference to human plans. The rains were decent, the yields were average, and the price of corn hovered in that dangerous zone where a man could survive, but he couldn't get ahead. For Silas, survival was enough. His input costs were low. He didn't have payments on his machinery. When the water pump on the Farmall blew in the middle of harvest, he walked to his shop, pulled a spare off a junked carcass he kept for parts, and was back in the field in 40 minutes. Cost $0 and a little skin off his knuckles. For Carter Sterling, however, average was a death sentence. It started with a sensor. It was the peak of planting season, that critical 2-week window where the seed has to get into the ground or the yield drops by the hour. The weather forecast was predicting 3 weeks of heavy rain starting on Friday. Everyone was pushing hard, running 24 hours a day. Silas was out in his field, his headlights cutting through the dusty darkness. The Farmall was pulling an old 4-row planter. It was slow, tedious work. He had to turn his head constantly to check the rows, his neck stiff and aching. But the seed was going down. Row by row. Steady. Across the fence line on the Sterling megafarm there was silence. Silas throttled down at the end of a row and wiped the sweat from his brow. He looked over toward Carter's land. Usually the massive floodlights of the John Deere X9 lit up the night like a stadium. Tonight it was dark. Curiosity and a grudging sense of neighborly duty got the better of him. Silas killed the engine, climbed down, and walked to the barbed wire fence. "Carter!" he shouted into the dark. A beam of a flashlight swung wildly, blinding him for a second. "What do you want, Silas?" Carter's voice was ragged, high-pitched with stress. Silas shielded his eyes. "Just wondering why the stadium lights are off. Rain's coming, Carter. You got 500 acres left to plant?" Carter walked to the fence. In the pale moonlight, he looked like a ghost. His eyes were sunken, and he was vibrating with caffeine and panic. "It's the ECU!" Carter spat, kicking a clod of dirt. "The exhaust control unit. The computer thinks the emissions are out of compliance. It put the tractor into limp mode. It won't go over 2 miles an hour, and the hydraulics are locked out. It's a brick, a $500,000 brick." "Fix it," Silas said simply. "I can't!" Carter screamed, his voice cracking. "It's encrypted. I tried to bypass the sensor, and the whole system shut down. Voided the warranty instantly. I called the dealer. They said they can't get a tech out here until Tuesday. Tuesday, Silas. It's going to rain on Friday." Silas leaned against the fence post, chewing on a stalk of grass. "So you're telling me you can't plant because a computer chip thinks your exhaust smells bad?" "It's the regulations." Carter threw his hands up. "It's the software. I have a loan payment due in 3 months, Silas. A big one. If I don't get this crop in—" He trailed off, the weight of the reality crushing him. This was the trap. The golden handcuffs. Carter had the best equipment money could buy, but he didn't own the right to repair it. He was a tenant in his own machine. "I got the old planter," Silas said quietly. "And the Farmall is running hot." Carter looked at him confused. "What? I'm saying once I finish my plot around noon tomorrow, I can bring the Iron Lady over. It ain't fast. It only does 4 rows at a time. But she doesn't have a computer to tell her when to quit." Carter laughed, a dry, humorless bark. "You're going to plant 500 acres with that antique. It would take a week. I need it done in 2 days." "Better late than never," Silas shrugged. "No." Carter shook his head, his pride still wrestling with his desperation. "I called a contractor from over in Hastings. He's bringing a fleet in tomorrow afternoon. High-speed planters. It's going to cost me 20 grand, but I don't have a choice." 20 grand, Silas whistled. "That's a steep bill, Carter." "It's the cost of doing business." Carter recited the mantra, though it sounded less convincing than it had in the diner 2 years ago. "Go back to your garden patch, Silas. Let the professionals handle the crisis." Silas nodded slowly. He didn't take offense. He just felt a deep, abiding pity. "Suit yourself, neighbor. But remember, the rain doesn't care about your business model." Silas went back to his tractor. The Farmall roared to life on the first crank. As he chugged away, laying down seed, he watched Carter, standing alone in the dark, staring at a silent machine that was smarter than a rocket ship, but useless as a paperweight. The contractor from Hastings showed up the next day, just as Carter promised. They were fast. They were expensive. Carter got his crop in the ground hours before the first raindrops fell. He saved the season, but the bill for the emergency planting combined with the repair costs for the tractor's computer system wiped out his profit margin for the year before the corn had even sprouted. Carter had survived, but the water was rising. That winter, the rumors started swirling in town. The local bank, First National of Cedar Ridge, had been bought out by a larger regional conglomerate. The old handshake deals were gone. The new bankers wore suits, not boots, and they looked at spreadsheets, not character. Silas went in to renew his operating line of credit. A small amount he used for seed and fertilizer usually paid off by December. He sat across from a young woman named Ms. Kinsley. She was typing furiously on her keyboard. "Mr. Abernathy," she said, not making eye contact. "I see here your assets are dated." "My assets are paid for," Silas corrected. "Yes, but the collateral value of a 1949 tractor is negligible." She sighed, adjusting her glasses. "And your land? You haven't soil tested in 3 years. You don't use the recommended GMO hybrids. Your yields are 20% below the county average." "My costs are 50% below the county average," Silas countered. "I make a profit every year. Can you say that for the big guys?" Miss Kinsley stopped typing. She looked at him with a strange expression, half annoyance, half curiosity. "Mr. Abernathy, the bank is pivoting toward high-growth partners. We are encouraging our clients to modernize. There are loan packages available. You could upgrade that. Equipment. Scale up. Buy the subplot next to you." "I don't want debt," Silas said firmly. "Then you might find it hard to compete," she said coldly. "The market is tightening. The margin for error is disappearing. If you don't grow, you go." Silas leaned forward. "Let me tell you something, miss. I've seen men grow themselves right out of a home. I'll stick to my rust." He got his small loan, but barely. As he walked out of the bank, he passed Carter Sterling coming in. Carter looked older. His hair was thinning, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He wasn't swaggering anymore. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. "Silas," Carter nodded, his voice subdued. "Carter," Silas replied. "How's the high-tech life treating you?" "It's complicated," Carter murmured. "Just refinancing. Interest rates are ticking up, you know. Just moving money around." "Be careful, son," Silas said, placing a heavy hand on Carter's shoulder. "That shell game only works until the music stops." Carter shrugged his hand off a flash of the old arrogance returning. "I'm buying the Miller place, Silas. Another 200 acres. Economies of scale. It's the only way to make the numbers work. I'm going to be the biggest producer in the state." "You're digging a hole, Carter," Silas warned. "I'm building an empire," Carter snapped, pushing past him into the bank. Silas walked out to his truck. The wind was picking up cold and biting. He looked at the sky. It was a grey steel color. He could feel it in his bones. A storm was coming. Not a rainstorm, but an economic hurricane. And men like Carter Sterling were standing on the beach, holding lightning rods, daring the thunder to strike. The crisis didn't arrive with a bang. It didn't come as a tornado tearing through the silos or a fire sweeping through the barns. It came as a notification on a screen. It was a Tuesday in late July. The corn was tasseling, reaching that critical height where the ears begin to form. It was the time for the second round of spraying fungicide and nutrient application. In modern high-yield farming, timing is everything. You miss the window by 3 days and the mold sets in. You miss it by a week and you lose 20 bushels an acre. Silas was in his machine shed. The air inside was cool and smelled of old grease and iron. He was performing a ritual as old as the tractor itself, packing the wheel bearings. He sat on a low stool, a glob of red high-temp grease in the palm of his hand. He took the steel bearing cage from the Farmall's front axle and worked the grease into the rollers, kneading it like dough. Squish, slap, turn. It was messy, tactile work. There were no sensors to tell him the bearing was lubricated. He knew it was done when he felt the resistance change in his fingers. Outside, the silence of the afternoon was shattered by the sound of a truck engine revving too high, tires spinning on gravel. Silas wiped his hands on a shop rag and walked to the door. Carter Sterling's pickup skidded to a halt near the barn. Carter didn't just step out. He practically fell out his face. Pale, his phone clutched in his hand like a lifeline that had been cut. "Is your phone working?" Carter asked, his voice trembling. Silas pulled his old flip phone from his overall pocket. got signal. Why not the signal?" Carter waved his hand frantically. "The network. The AgriNet." "Don't use it," Silas said, leaning against the doorframe. Carter paced in a tight circle, kicking up dust. "The system is down. Globally. It's a ransomware attack. Some hacker group in Eastern Europe got into the servers of the manufacturer. They locked the source code, Silas. Everything." Silas narrowed his eyes. "What does that mean for the tractor?" "It means they're bricks," Carter whispered the horror of it, finally settling in his eyes. "The sprayers utilize real-time GPS, guided by the central server to modulate the nozzle flow. It's a security feature to prevent chemical drift. If the server doesn't handshake with the tractor every 15 minutes, the machine goes into safety lockout. It shuts down the pumps. It locks the transmission." Silas looked out at his own field, then back at the frantic man. "So you have $1 million of equipment that won't start because a stranger in Europe pressed a button. It's not just me," Carter said, his voice cracking. "It's everyone. The dealer in town, Bennett's place there, are 50 farmers down there right now screaming. They can't spray. The fungicide needs to go down today. The humidity is 90%. The blight is coming." "Well," Silas said, slowly turning back to his shop, "I guess I better finish these bearings." "How can you be so calm?" Carter shouted. "Don't you get it? If I lose 20% of my yield to blight, I can't make the lease payments on the sprayers. If I miss the payments, the rates adjust. I'm leveraged to the hilt, Silas. I have to spray." Silas stopped and looked at the younger man. "I have a 50-gallon tank sprayer that mounts on the back of the Farmall. It runs off the PTO shaft. No computer. Just a mechanical pump." Carter looked at him, hope warring with pride. "Can I borrow it?" "It only covers 4 rows," Silas reminded him. "You have 2,000 acres now with the Miller place." "I don't care. I'll run it 24 hours a day." "You can't," Silas said gently. "The Farmall doesn't have auto steer. You have to drive it. You have to watch the rows. After 12 hours, you'll be seeing double. After 18, you'll drive into a ditch. You can't farm 2,000 acres with 1940s tools, Carter. The math doesn't work." Carter stared at him, and for the first time, Silas saw the boy behind the businessman, the scared kid who had tried to impress his father and then the bank. "What do I do?" Carter asked. "You pray for dry weather so the blight doesn't spread," Silas said. "And you learn a hard lesson about who actually owns your farm." Carter drove away defeated. Silas went back to his bearings. He finished the job, reassembled the hub, and tightened the castle nut. He put the cotter pin in and bent the legs back. 10 minutes later, he fired up the Farmall. He hitched up the small sprayer. He mixed his chemicals by hand, pouring jugs into the tank and stirring it with a wooden paddle. He didn't have a digital flow meter. He calculated the application rate in his head speed, times pressure divided by nozzle width. He drove out into his field. The engine thrummed a steady rhythmic heartbeat. Chug, chug, chug. He engaged the pump. The mist sprayed out over his corn. For the next 3 days, Silas Abernathy was the only farmer in Cedar Ridge moving. The massive green and red machines of his neighbors sat silent in the fields, looking like stranded whales. Their owners sat in their cabs staring at screens that displayed a red connection error message, waiting for a corporation 1,000 miles away to give them permission to work their own land. Silas worked slowly. He did his 180 acres. Then, because he was a decent man, he drove over to the Miller place, the land Carter had just bought, and sprayed the perimeter, trying to create a buffer zone for his neighbor. He sat on the open seat, the sun beating down on his neck, the chemical smell mixing with the diesel. He was tired, his back ached, and his ears rang from the engine noise. But he was free. November brought the cold, and with it, the reckoning. The ransomware attack had eventually been resolved, but the damage was done. The yields across the county were down. The blight had taken its tithe. But for Carter Sterling, the low yield was only the first punch. The knockout blow came from the Federal Reserve. In an effort to curb inflation, interest rates were hiked, then hiked again. Silas sat at his kitchen table reviewing his ledger. He used a pencil and a physical notebook. On the left, expenses. On the right, income. His expenses were up slightly. Diesel was expensive, and parts were getting harder to find. But he was in the black. He had no debt service. Every dollar he made from his corn was his to keep. He drank his coffee, satisfied. He would buy a new pair of work boots this winter. Maybe a new coat. That was enough. Town, however, felt like a funeral. Silas drove his truck to the hardware store to pick up some chains for the winter. The mood on Main Street was brittle. For sale signs were popping up on lawns. He ran into Greg Henderson, one of the younger farmers who usually followed Carter around. Greg looked 10 years older than he had a year ago. "Morning, Greg." Silas nodded. "Mr. Abernathy," Greg mumbled, looking at his boots. "How's the harvest finishing up?" Greg laughed, a bitter, sharp sound. "It ain't. The bank called my operating note early. Said my collateral value dropped because land prices are softening. I had to sell my combine just to pay off the fuel bill from last year. I'm hiring a custom crew to harvest, but they can't get to me until December. If it snows before then, I'm done." "I'm sorry to hear that, son," Silas said genuinely. "Carter's in worse shape." Greg lowered his voice, looking around as if the bankers were listening from the alleyways. "He's got a variable rate loan on that land he bought from the Miller estate. The payment just doubled Silas. He needs 200 bushels an acre just to break even. With the blight, he's pulling 160. "He's underwater," Silas noted. "He's at the bottom of the ocean," Greg corrected. 2 days later, the weather turned. The sky bruised purple and black, and the wind shifted from the north, carrying the scent of ice. A blizzard was coming. An early, heavy, wet blizzard that would flatten any corn left standing. It was 4 p.m. The light was failing. Silas had finished his harvest a week ago. His corn was safely in the bin, dried and ready to sell when the price was right. He was in his living room reading a book by the fire when he heard the pounding on his front door. It wasn't a knock. It was a desperate hammering. Silas opened the door. Carter Sterling stood there. He was covered in grease and mud. His expensive polo shirt was torn. He was shivering not just from the cold, but from adrenaline and shock. "Silas," he gasped. I need the Iron Lady." Silas ushered him inside. "Come in, Carter. Get warm." "No time." Carter backed away, his eyes wide and wild. "I have 80 acres left, the 80 acres in the bottomland. It's the best corn I have. If I get it out, I make the payment. If the snow hits it, I default. I lose the farm, Silas. All of it." "So go harvest it," Silas said. "I can't," Carter screamed, tears mixing with the grime on his face. "The X9, it's stuck. Stuck." "The bottomland is soft," Carter explained rapidly. "It rained last night. The X9 weighs 30 tons. I drove it in, and it sank to the axles. I tried to rock it out, and the transmission overheated. The computer locked it in park to save the gearbox. It won't move. It's sitting there dead, and the storm is 2 hours away." "You need a tow," Silas said calmly. "I called the heavy wrecker service," Carter sobbed. "They said 4 hours. The snow will be here by then. I need to pull it out now so I can finish the field before the whiteout hits. My tractor weighs 6,000 pounds, Carter. Yours weighs 60,000. Physics is physics. Please," Carter begged, falling to his knees on the porch. It was a shocking sight, the CEO of the soil. The man who had mocked the rusty antique kneeling before the man who owned it. "Please, Silas, just try. It's the only thing that runs. Everyone else has put their equipment away or sold it. You're the only one." Silas looked at the desperate man, then at the darkening sky. He sighed. "Get in the truck." They drove to the barn. Silas didn't rush. He checked the oil in the Farmall. He checked the coolant. He walked to the back of the shop and grabbed a heavy rusted log chain links, as thick as a man's wrist. "That chain is 70 years old," Carter said, wiping his nose. "Will it hold?" "It was forged in a steel mill in Pittsburgh," Silas said, throwing it into the toolbox. "It'll hold." He fired up the tractor. He didn't take the truck. He needed to feel the road. He drove the Farmall down the highway, the lights dim yellow circles on the asphalt, Carter following in his pickup, with his hazard lights flashing. They arrived at the bottomland. It was a disaster scene. The massive John Deere X9, a machine that cost $500,000, was buried to its belly in black mud. It looked like a spaceship that had crash-landed in a swamp. Silas drove the Farmall into the field. He stayed on the high ground, reading the terrain. He backed the old tractor up toward the behemoth. "Hook it to the rear drawbar," Silas shouted over the wind. Carter scrambled in the mud, dragging the heavy chain. He hooked it to the tow point of the massive combine, then to the simple steel loop on the back of the Farmall. "It's not gonna work," Carter yelled, looking at the size difference. The Farmall looked like a toy next to the X9. Silas didn't answer. He settled into the metal seat. He gripped the steering wheel. He didn't just mash the throttle. This required finesse. He put the Farmall in first gear. He lowered the throttle. He eased off the clutch until the chain snapped taut. The Farmall groaned. The rear tires bit into the earth, slipping slightly. Easy old girl, Silas thought. He needed traction, not speed. He stood up on the pedals to put more weight on the rear axle. He feathered the throttle. The engine barked a deep, defiant pow, pow, pow as the governor kicked in, demanding more fuel. The Farmall's front wheels lifted off the ground. Silas leaned forward, using his body weight to keep the nose down. "Come on!" Carter screamed from the sidelines. The mud sucked at the combine. The chain sang a high-pitched note of tension. Silas felt the tractor shudder. He was asking for everything the pistons had. But then he felt it. A microscopic shift. The suction broke. Slowly, agonizingly, the massive combine inched forward. The Farmall dug trenches in the earth, clawing for every inch. Smoke poured from the stack, but it kept pulling. It didn't overheat. It didn't throw a code. It just converted diesel into torque. Foot by foot, Silas dragged the green monster out of the muck and onto the solid ground of the access road. He killed the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. Carter ran over, panting. "You did it. My God, you did it." Silas sat on the seat for a moment, his hands vibrating from the effort. "She's out. Now can you unlock the transmission?" I think so. If I do a hard reset on the battery," Carter stammered. "Get to it," Silas said, pointing at the sky. The first flake of snow landed on his cheek. "You got work to do." Carter scrambled up the ladder of his machine. Silas unhooked the chain and coiled it back onto his platform. He watched as Carter finally got the combine moving, tearing into the corn with a desperate fury. The giant machine roared away, harvesting the crop that would save Carter's life for one more year. Silas turned the Farmall toward home. He was cold. He was hungry. He wouldn't get a dime for this. But as he drove back down the dark highway, the snow swirling in his headlights, he patted the warm metal of the dashboard. "They just don't make 'em like you anymore," he whispered. The end of the Sterling Empire didn't come with a bang or a storm. It came on a Tuesday morning in early March, under a sky so blue and innocent it felt like an insult to the men standing on the gravel driveway. The foreclosure signs had been up for a month, bright orange stickers plastered on the windows of the massive machine sheds. "Auction!" they screamed in bold black letters. "Complete liquidation." Silas arrived early. He parked his battered Ford truck at the edge of the property, far away from the gleaming SUVs of the corporate buyers who had flown in from Chicago and Omaha. He walked up the long driveway, his boots crunching on the gravel. He wore his Sunday suit, a charcoal wool set that was 20 years out of style, out of respect. You don't wear overalls to a man's funeral, and make no mistake, this was a funeral. The yard was full. Neighbors from 3 counties were there. Most of them were quiet hands in their pockets, kicking at the dirt. They weren't there to buy. They were there to witness the grim reaper of agriculture at work. They looked at the rows of equipment lined up like soldiers facing a firing squad. There was the John Deere X9, combine, the one Silas had pulled from the mud. It had been pressure washed and waxed, shining in the sun. There were the 3 high-speed planters, the 2 dually pickup trucks, the autonomous drone scouting system, and there was Carter Sterling. He stood near the auctioneer's podium, looking like a man who had been hollowed out. He was gaunt. The arrogance that had filled the diner years ago was gone, replaced by a nervous twitch in his left eye. He held a styrofoam cup of coffee that he wasn't drinking. "All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's get this started." The auctioneer boomed over the PA system. He was a professional, brisk and unfeeling. To him, this wasn't a tragedy, it was just inventory. The bidding started with the small items, tools, welders, generators. They went fast. Then came the big iron, lot number 45. 2024 John Deere X9, low hours, 1 owner. Who'll give me 300, 300. The auctioneer's chant was a rhythmic, hypnotic song of destruction. Habadabada, 300 bid now, 4 quarter. Silas watched as the combine sold for $420,000. It sounded like a fortune, but Silas knew the loan against it was likely over $600,000. The bank was taking a haircut, but Carter was taking the fall. One by one, the machines were sold. The shiny computerized, subscription-based miracles of modern farming were stripped away. The neighbors watched in silence. They knew the math. They knew that every piece of equipment sold was a dream that had turned into a nightmare. Then came the silence. The auctioneer paused and took a sip of water. The crowd shifted. The equipment was gone. Now came the main event. Lot number 100. The auctioneer announced, his voice dropping an octave. The real property, consisting of 500 acres of prime Cedar Ridge bottomland, including the farmhouse, 3 barns and grain storage facilities. This was it. The land. The dirt. The only thing that truly mattered. Carter Sterling turned away. He couldn't watch. He stared out at the horizon, his back to the crowd. "We will start the bidding at $4,000 an acre," the auctioneer cried. "4,000, shouted a man in a black suit near the front, a representative for an investment firm that turned farms into solar panel arrays or tax write-offs. 4.25, yelled another suit. The price climbed. The locals stayed silent. They couldn't compete with the corporate money. The price hit $6,000 an acre. Then $7,000 an acre, looking for $7,250. The auctioneer scanned the crowd. The corporate buyers looked bored. They were checking their phones. This was just a transaction to them. Silas Abernathy stepped forward. He didn't shout. He just raised his hand, holding a small card with the number 007 on it. The auctioneer paused. He knew Silas. Everyone knew Silas. 7,250 from Mr. Abernathy. The auctioneer said, a hint of surprise in his voice. The man in the black suit looked back, annoyed. He whispered to his colleague, then nodded. 7,500. 7,500, the auctioneer called. Back to you, Silas. Silas nodded once. 7,750. A murmur went through the crowd. Miris, the man who drove a rusted tractor, the man who taped his diner booth with duct tape. Where was he getting this kind of money? The suit frowned. He raised his paddle. 8,000. $8,000 an acre, the auctioneer sang out. That's $4 million total, folks. Do I hear 8,250? The suit smirked. He thought he had crushed the local yokel. Silas didn't flinch. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. He didn't look at the bank representative. He looked at the land. He looked at the soil that had been abused, oversprayed, and compacted by heavy machinery, but was still good, honest dirt underneath. 8,500, Silas said clearly. The crowd gasped. Carter Sterling spun around, his mouth falling open. The suit looked angry now. He made a call on his cell phone. He argued for a moment, then hung up and shook his head. He was out. The algorithm said the ROI wasn't there at that price. Going once at 8,500, the auctioneer called, scanning the yard. Going twice. The silence stretched heavy and thick. A crow cawed from the power line. Sold to Silas Abernathy. The gavel slammed down. The sound echoed off the metal siding of the empty barns. Silas lowered his hand. He didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He just took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the land that was now his. The paperwork took an hour. Silas sat in the makeshift office, set up in the machine shed, signing his name in neat cursive script. He didn't need a loan officer. He handed over a cashier's check for the deposit, drawn from an account that had been slowly accumulating compound interest since 1975. When he walked out, the sun was beginning to set. The crowd was gone. The corporate buyers had flown back to their glass towers. The transport trucks were already loading up the John Deere X9 to take it away. Only Carter Sterling remained. He was sitting on the tailgate of his truck, the only thing the bank hadn't taken lightly, because it had too many miles on it. He looked like a man waking up from a long coma. Silas walked over to him. The gravel crunched under his boots. Silas, Carter said, his voice raspy. I don't understand. What don't you understand, son? Silas asked, leaning against the fender. You're broke, Carter said, shaking his head. You drive a truck from the 90s. You use a tractor from the 40s. You never go on vacation. You wear the same clothes every day. How did you just drop $4 million cash? Silas looked at the younger man with a mixture of pity and sternness. I'm not broke, Carter. I'm just not flashy. Silas pointed a calloused finger toward the empty machine shed. You spent 20 years buying things that went down in value, Silas said softly. New trucks every 2 years. New combines. New tech. You paid interest on all of it. You were working for the bank, Carter. You were a sharecropper on your own land, and you didn't even know it. Carter looked down at his hands. I was trying to be efficient. I was trying to scale. You were trying to impress people who don't care about you, Silas corrected him. I put my money in land, and I put the rest in the bank. I fixed what I had. I welded. I scavenged. I didn't pay a dime in interest for 40 years. Compound interest is a powerful thing, Carter. It works for you, or it works against you. You chose against. Carter buried his face in his hands. It's gone. My grandfather's land. It's all gone. It's not gone, Silas said. It's just under new management. Carter looked up, confused. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. Not the keys to the farmhouse, but a single brass key. "There's a cottage on the north side of the property," Silas said. "The old tenant house. It needs a new roof, and the plumbing is shot, but the bones are good." "I know it," Carter whispered. "You can live there," Silas said, placing the key on the tailgate next to Carter. "Rent-free, on one condition." "What?" Carter asked, tears welling in his eyes. "You work for me," Silas said, "and we do things my way. No satellites, no subscriptions. You learn to weld. You learn to listen to the engine, not the computer. We're going to rest this soil. We're going to plant cover crops. We're going to heal this ground." Carter stared at the key. It was a lifeline, a chance to stay on the land he loved even if he no longer owned it. A chance to learn the things he had mocked. "Why?" Carter asked. "After everything I said to you, after I called you a fool." Silas looked out toward the field, where the evening shadows were stretching long across the stubble. "Because a man who loses his land loses his soul," Silas said quietly. "And I don't want that on my conscience. Besides, I need someone to drive the Farmall while I fix the fence." Carter picked up the key. He gripped it tight, his knuckles turning white. "Thank you, Silas." "Don't thank me yet," Silas grunted, pushing himself off the truck. "Be at the barn at 5 a.m. We've got manure to spread." The following spring, the neighbors who drove past the old Sterling place saw a strange sight. There were no massive green monsters roaring through the fields. There were no drones buzzing in the air. Instead, there was a steady, rhythmic chug, chug, chug echoing off the hills. In the middle of the vast 500-acre field, a small, rusted red tractor was pulling a plow. The paint was faded, the fenders were dented, and the seat was worn. But the furrows behind it were straight as an arrow. Driving the tractor was Carter Sterling. He was wearing a pair of grease-stained overalls. He looked tired, but he looked healthy. He looked grounded. And standing at the edge of the field, leaning on a fence post, was Silas Abernathy. He was watching the smoke rise from the stack of the 1949 Farmall M. They called him a fool for keeping it. They laughed at his rust. But as the sun set over the merged lands of the Abernathy estate, the Iron Lady kept pulling, paid for reliable and free. The shiny machines were rusting in a scrapyard somewhere, their software outdated, and their screens dark. But the Farmall just kept ploughing. In a world obsessed with the new, the fast, and the flashy, it is easy to forget the value of what endures. Carter Sterling chased the future and found himself bankrupt. Silas Abernathy held on to the past and found himself a king. The neighbors stopped laughing a long time ago. Now, when they drive by and hear the distinctive chug of that old engine, they don't see a relic. They see the sound of freedom. Because Silas knew the secret that the modern world had forgotten, he who owns his tools owns his destiny. And while plastic cracks and software crashes iron, iron is forever. What about you? Are you chasing the latest upgrade, or are you building something that lasts? Do you have an old iron in your life, a car, a tool, or a tradition that you refuse to give up on? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of patience and justice, please hit that like button. It helps us share these stories with more people. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a tale from the heartland. Thanks for watching, and keep your rows straight.